Arawera.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Speaker, huri rauna ki ora tātou katoa e te whare, tātou e noho nei ki roto i tō tātou whare mire. Tēnei haoro te pō, tēnā koutou ki ora tātou katoa. Mr. Speaker, whenever people screech and carry on about the sins of youth, this guy, his name keeps getting brought up time and time again, Judge Andrew Beecroft, Principal Judge of the Youth Court since 2001, is quick to point out, and rightfully so I might add, that youth offending has remained relatively stable and even reduced in some areas, while violent crime has increased right across the spectrum, particularly in the 51 to 99 year age group, which makes you wonder why all of a sudden government has decided to spend $84 million on targeting serious and repeat offenders in the youth court, when in fact only 1% of kids actually end up before the court. Government should be focusing on the key issues put forward by people like Judge Beecroft, like more targeted resourcing and the coordination of relevant agencies, instead of beefing up the court infrastructure and extending the court's jurisdiction to include 12 to 13-year-olds. And we're not walking away from our responsibility for dealing with serious and repeat offending amongst a small group of youth either, Mr. Speaker. We know that this country has to deal with it honestly and openly, but we also know this: increasing the thumping power of the courts, criminalising even younger kids, and dishing out orders and punishments like French fries quite simply doesn't work. Research from all around the world, as provided to me by Chester Burrows, shows that the countries who invest more in communities and in rehabilitative justice have lower criminal offending rates than those that use the big stick approach that this bill is proposing. One report out of Britain shows that the more face time you spend with kids at risk and the better you target resources to helping them, the better the outcome you get and the lower the cost your society pays as well. That same report proved that the cost of support services needed to help youth break out of the cycle of criminal offending is less than a quarter the cost of keeping them locked up. And all that confirms what we already know, that the best way to reform young offenders is to help them deal with the issues in their lives and equip them to make better choices in the future. And of course, the long-term cost savings aren't just economic. People profit as well. Offenders, their families, their communities, and society at large. And that, Mr. Speaker, is what whānau ora is all about. Taking the funding currently being wasted in futile, one-size-fits-all social recovery programs run by government agencies and targeting that funding in ways that enable families in their communities to lift themselves out of despair and to raise themselves to another level. Mr. Speaker, there's been a lot of talk about boot camps too, and while I have a soft spot for good programs, boot camps or whatever you want to call them, that encourage rangatahi to challenge themselves and to raise their sights, I know too that some are based on simply isolating and treating kids to a short, sharp shock. And I know that all that does is increase their sense of alienation and fuel their anger. Boot camps are okay, but they simply will not work just by making somebody fitter, faster, and harder to catch. There must also be strong elements of rehabilitation and a challenge to youth to reach their potential. Dr. John Langley, member of the Independent Advisory Group on Youth Justice, said that the one single factor that correlates most highly with violent behaviour in our young people is that those who commit it have had an excess of violence and punishment inflicted upon them. Why dish out more when we know that has caused the damage to them in the first place? Such an approach is both wasteful and logically absurd. At its extreme, this wasteful and absurd approach also threatens the whānau-centred approach articulated by the Māori Party and enshrined in the Children, Young Persons and Their Families Act. What this country needs now are effective interventions and programs like those where communities taking responsibility for their youth are supported by resources that would otherwise be spent on their incarceration, and reinvesting the savings in other community youth programs. The results of those interventions and those programs are clear. Increased community care, a 25% reduction in detention and probation, and a 75% drop in jail time. And that, Mr. Speaker, is what we should be talking about. Strengthening communities and helping them to develop their own solutions to take care of their own kids, which was also the basis of the Children, Young Persons and Their Families Act. Treatment, rehabilitation and restoration. A youth justice system based on making young offenders accountable for their actions, but also, because they're just children, based on rehabilitation and restoration. Principles which remain the basis of our world-leading reputation in the field of youth justice, a reputation which this bill places at risk. Mr. Speaker, the 1989 Children, Young Persons and Their Families Act was the brainchild of John Langiho and others who wrote Puao Te Atatu, and recognised the centrality and importance of the whānau to the care and protection of young people and having positive alternatives to custodial sentencing based on families and communities taking responsibility for their own. This bill, Mr. Speaker, will erode some of those principles, so regretfully we will be opposing this bill and focusing our energy on making whānau ora a concept that will help to turn whānau, communities and the whole of Aotearoa around. Kia ora tātou.